Somewhere in America right now, a family is sitting on wealth that took decades to build. Maybe it is a paid-off house in California. Maybe it is a family business in Texas. Maybe it is a portfolio of stocks, rental properties, retirement accounts, or farmland that quietly grew while everyone else was busy working, spending, and paying bills. And eventually, that money will move. It will go from a parent to a child, from a grandparent to a grandchild. And when that happens, the biggest question will not be, how much money did the family build? The real question will be, can the next generation keep it? Because building wealth and keeping wealth are two completely different skills. A person can spend 30 years building a $2 million portfolio and lose most of it within a few years of handing it over. Another family can build something similar and structure it so the money continues supporting children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren decades later. That difference usually isn't intelligence. It isn't always income. And it certainly isn't luck. It comes down to rules. Rules about what you buy. Rules about what you refuse to sell. Rules about taxes. Rules about family. And most importantly, rules about what the money is actually supposed to accomplish. I'm Della, and on this channel, we simplify investing, personal finance, and wealth building so you can make smarter financial decisions without needing a finance degree. If that sounds useful, subscribe and let's dive in. Because today, we're looking at 9 old money rules that help wealthy families keep their money for 100 years or more. And here's the interesting part. You don't need $10 million to start using these rules. You can apply many of them with your first $10,000, your first investment account, your first home, or even your next paycheck. Let's start with the rule that sits underneath almost everything else. Rule number 1, own things that grow, not things that constantly cost you. Think about the last time you got a raise. Maybe your salary went from $65,000 to $75,000. At first, it feels like you're finally getting ahead. Then somehow, 6 months later, you're driving a nicer car. Your apartment is more expensive. You upgraded your phone. You started eating out more. Maybe you took on a bigger mortgage because the bank said you could afford it. And suddenly that $10,000 raise has disappeared. Your income went up. Your lifestyle went up. But your wealth barely moved. Old money families think about purchases differently. Before they ask, can I afford this? They ask, will this make me richer, or will this create another bill? That's a completely different question. A luxury car might make you feel richer. But financially, the car is usually an expense that depreciates while demanding insurance, maintenance, fuel, registration, and repairs. A productive asset works in the opposite direction. A diversified investment portfolio can potentially grow. A rental property can potentially generate income and appreciate. A profitable business can produce cash flow. Even a simple broad market index fund can give you ownership in hundreds or thousands of companies. The goal isn't to avoid spending money. The goal is to make sure your assets grow faster than your lifestyle. Here's why that matters. Suppose you invest $10,000 and somehow average 7% annually. You don't need to add another dollar for 30 years. That $10,000 could grow to roughly $76,000. Leave it alone for 50 years, and you're looking at nearly $300,000. That's the magic of compounding. The money starts making money. Then that money starts making money. And eventually, the growth becomes much larger than the original amount you put in. Now compare that with spending the same $10,000 on something that loses value. You don't get compounding. You get depreciation. And that's one of the biggest differences between building wealth and looking wealthy. The wealthy aren't necessarily against nice things. They simply don't want their lifestyle to consume the machine producing their wealth. Imagine you have a $500,000 investment portfolio. It generates growth. It produces dividends. It gives you options. Now imagine you sell $100,000 of it to buy a luxury car. You didn't just spend $100,000. You also gave up the future growth that $100,000 could have produced. That's the hidden cost. Every dollar you spend today has a second price. What that dollar could have become. This is why old money families often look strangely conservative from the outside. They may own valuable assets but drive ordinary cars. They may have millions invested but live in a home that doesn't scream, "I'm rich." Because they understand something most people don't. Looking wealthy and becoming wealthy are completely different games. And there is another trap here. It's what I call the lifestyle multiplier. One expensive purchase rarely stays one expensive purchase. Buy a boat? Now you need storage. insurance, fuel, maintenance, a trailer, maybe a truck capable of pulling it, buy a massive house. Now you have higher property taxes, more furniture, more utilities, more maintenance, landscaping, repairs. And suddenly your $900,000 house is not just a $900,000 decision. It's a lifetime stream of expenses. Old money thinking asks, what is the total cost of owning this thing for the next 10 years? Not just, can I make the monthly payment? That's a powerful distinction for an ordinary American household. Because the goal isn't to impress people in 2026. The goal is to create a financial position your family will still be proud of in 2056. And that leads directly into rule number 2. Rule number 2, stay invisible. There are two kinds of wealth. The kind everyone can see, and the kind nobody notices. Old money prefers the second. Walk through an affluent neighborhood and you might expect every driveway to contain a brand new luxury SUV. Sometimes it does. But often, the wealthiest household is the one with the 10-year-old Toyota sitting quietly in the driveway. Why? Because they don't need their possessions to prove their financial position. And this matters more than you might think. Let's say two Americans each earn $200,000 a year. Same income. Same city. Same career stage. One person spends heavily because they want everyone to know they are successful. The other keeps their lifestyle relatively simple and invests aggressively. Suppose the first person saves only $10,000 a year. The second saves $50,000. That's a $40,000 annual difference. Over 25 years, assuming a 7% average return, that gap alone can become enormous. The difference wasn't their salary. It wasn't their investment genius. It was their ability to resist lifestyle inflation. And here's where staying invisible becomes even more powerful. When people know you have money, expectations change. Family members may expect help. Friends may expect you to pick up the check. Salespeople see you as a target. You may start buying things simply because people around you are buying them. And eventually, your financial life becomes a performance. You have to keep proving that you're successful. New car. New watch. Bigger house. More expensive vacations. More expensive everything. The problem is that status has no finish line. There is always somebody with a bigger house, a newer car, a more expensive vacation, a larger investment account. So if your definition of success depends on being richer than the people around you, you'll never actually feel rich. Old money families tend to play a different game. They ask, how much freedom does this money give us? Not, how impressive do we look? That shift is incredibly important. Because money's greatest power isn't the ability to buy expensive things. It's the ability to buy options. The option to leave a terrible job. The option to help your parents. The option to take 6 months off. The option to pay for your child's college. The option to handle a medical emergency without putting it on a credit card. The option to retire without depending entirely on Social Security. And eventually, the option to help the next generation start from a stronger position. That's what real wealth looks like. Not a Lamborghini parked outside the house. Freedom sitting quietly in the background. And this is why some wealthy families deliberately keep their lifestyles several steps below what their income allows. They don't spend everything the bank says they can afford. They don't treat every raise as permission to upgrade their life. They let their assets get bigger first. Then, if they want the nicer house or better car later, they can buy it without destroying the machine that created the wealth. That is a completely different relationship with money. And it brings us to something even more powerful. Because wealthy families don't only think about making money. They think about moving it efficiently from one generation to the next. And that's where rule number 3 begins. Rule number 3, start transferring wealth before you're gone. Most Americans think of inheritance as something that happens after death. Someone passes away. The will gets opened. Assets are distributed. The children receive whatever is left. But wealthy families often think much earlier. They don't wait until the funeral to start teaching the next generation about money. They begin transferring knowledge, responsibility, and sometimes assets while they are still alive. And there is an important reason for that. You can't teach somebody how to manage a fortune after you've already handed them the fortune. Imagine a 25-year-old suddenly receiving $1 million. They've never managed more than $5,000. They've never built a budget. They don't understand taxes. They've never invested through a market crash. They've never thought about estate planning. They've never had a serious conversation about what the money is supposed to accomplish. Now suddenly, they're responsible for $1 million. That's not necessarily a blessing. It can be a financial fire hose. Old money families understand that wealth should be transferred gradually, but financial education should begin immediately. A parent might help a child open an investment account. They might teach them how retirement accounts work. They might involve them in family financial decisions. They might help fund education. They might contribute toward a first home or business. And depending on their circumstances, they may use legitimate gifting and estate planning strategies to transfer assets during their lifetime. For example, federal tax law allows annual gifts up to a certain exclusion amount without using the lifetime gift and estate tax exemption, subject to the rules in effect for that year. The exact limits can change, which is why families with substantial assets generally work with estate planning and tax professionals rather than guessing. But the bigger lesson isn't the number. It's the strategy. Don't wait until the money changes hands to teach someone how to handle it. Teach first. Transfer gradually. Let them make small mistakes while the stakes are still small. Because the greatest inheritance you can give someone isn't necessarily $1 million. It's the ability to responsibly manage $1 million. And that is where we'll continue next. Because once you understand how wealthy families move money while they're alive, the next question becomes much more interesting. How do they use the tax rules to make sure the government doesn't take more of that wealth than necessary? That's where old money planning gets very serious. Now let's move into the part where wealthy families become much more deliberate about taxes, inheritance, and protecting assets. Rule number 3, transfer wealth while you're alive. One of the biggest mistakes families make is waiting until death to transfer everything. Old money families often start much earlier. Why? Because giving someone money and teaching someone to manage money are two completely different things. Imagine your 22-year-old suddenly inherits $1 million. They've never managed $100,000. They've never dealt with a market crash. They don't understand taxes. And they've never had to make serious financial decisions. That $1 million could disappear surprisingly fast. Instead, wealthy families often introduce money gradually. They might help pay for college, help with a first home, fund a business, or contribute to investment accounts. The exact tax rules and gift limits can change, so substantial transfers should be planned with a qualified tax or estate professional. But the principle is simple. Transfer the knowledge before you transfer the fortune. Because the best inheritance isn't just money. It's the ability to keep money. Rule number 4, don't automatically sell your biggest winners. Here's where taxes become extremely important. Imagine you bought an investment for $50,000. Years later, it's worth $500,000. You've created a $450,000 gain. If you sell, that gain may create a significant capital gains tax bill. So wealthy investors don't automatically sell simply because an investment has gone up. Sometimes they hold. Sometimes they rebalance strategically. And in certain estate planning situations, assets inherited at death may receive a step-up in cost basis, potentially reducing the taxable capital gain for heirs. For example, imagine a stock originally purchased for $50,000 eventually becomes worth $500,000. If the owner sells during their lifetime, the $450,000 gain can potentially be taxable. But if the asset is inherited and qualifies for a step-up in basis, the heir's new basis may be close to the property's fair market value at the owner's death. That can dramatically change the tax calculation. This is one reason wealthy families don't look at an investment and ask only, how much is it worth? They also ask, what happens tax-wise if I sell it? Because a $1 million asset isn't necessarily a $1 million asset after taxes. The lesson for ordinary investors? Don't create unnecessary taxable events just because you're impatient. Understand your cost basis. Understand capital gains. And think about taxes before you sell, not after. Rule number 5, put a wall around the wealth. Imagine spending 30 years building $3 million. And then watching a lawsuit, divorce, business failure, or financially irresponsible heir put that money at risk. That's why wealthy families don't just focus on accumulating assets. They think about protecting them. One of the most common tools is a trust. Think of a trust as a legal container with instructions. Instead of simply saying, here's your inheritance. Good luck. A family can establish rules about how and when assets are distributed. Money might be available for education, a first home, a medical need, or gradually released as the beneficiary reaches certain ages. The exact protections depend heavily on the type of trust and state law, so this isn't a DIY project. But the concept is powerful. Don't just build the house. Build the walls. And wealthy families often use other forms of legal and financial structure as well. Business entities, insurance, estate plans, prenuptial agreements, carefully designed trusts. The goal isn't to hide money. It's to make sure money built over decades doesn't disappear because of one bad event. Think about it this way. If your family worked for 40 years to build wealth, why would you leave the entire fortune sitting in one account with no plan? That's like building a skyscraper and refusing to install a foundation. The money needs structure. And structure becomes even more important when the fortune moves from one generation to the next. Because eventually, the person who built the wealth won't be around to protect it. And that's when the next rule becomes critical. You don't just inherit money. You inherit responsibility. And if the next generation isn't prepared for that responsibility, even a carefully protected fortune can eventually disappear. That's exactly what we'll tackle next. Rule number 6, raise stewards, not spenders. Here's one of the biggest reasons family wealth disappears. The money gets transferred, but the mindset doesn't. A child can inherit $2 million and still have no idea how to manage $20,000. That's why wealthy families often teach financial responsibility long before the inheritance arrives. Children learn where the family money came from. They learn how investments work. They see family members discussing financial decisions. They may receive small amounts to manage themselves and, importantly, they're allowed to make small mistakes. Because a $500 mistake at 18 can become a $500,000 mistake at 40 if nobody teaches you differently. The goal isn't to raise children who are afraid to spend. It's to raise adults who understand the difference between "I can afford it" and "I should buy it." That's a massive difference. A wealthy family doesn't want an heir who simply knows how to access money. They want an heir who knows how to protect it, grow it, and eventually pass it forward. Because an unprepared heir can destroy decades of work surprisingly quickly. Rule number 7, start compounding early. Old money families understand something incredibly powerful. Time is an asset. And unlike money, you can't earn more of it. Imagine a teenager invests $5,000 a year from age 18 through 25. That's only 8 years of contributions. After that, they stop adding money completely. If the investments average 7% over the long term, that early head start can continue compounding for decades. Now compare that with someone who waits until 45 to start. They may earn more money, but they've lost the most valuable ingredient: time. This is why accounts such as a 401k, Roth IRA, and 529 plan can become powerful tools when used appropriately. And when children have earned income, parents can explore legitimate ways to help them begin investing early. The point isn't that every teenager needs to become a stock market expert. The point is that the earlier you put productive dollars to work, the longer compounding has to do the heavy lifting. A dollar invested at 18 has almost 5 decades to grow before age 65. A dollar invested at 55 has only 10 years. Same dollar. Completely different opportunity. That's why old money families think in decades instead of months. They aren't asking, "How much can this investment make me this year?" They're asking, "What could this become if nobody interrupts the compounding?" And that mindset can change everything. Rule number 8, don't kill the goose just because you need the eggs. Here's a fascinating strategy used at the highest levels of wealth. Sometimes wealthy investors avoid selling their most valuable assets when they need cash. Instead, they may borrow against them. Why? Because selling an appreciated investment can potentially trigger capital gains taxes. A properly structured loan secured by an asset is different. The borrower receives cash, while the underlying asset remains invested. For example, imagine you own a diversified portfolio worth $1 million. You suddenly need $100,000. One option is to sell $100,000 of investments. Another possibility, depending on your financial situation, creditworthiness, interest rates, and risk tolerance, is borrowing against eligible assets. The investment remains invested. But here's the warning. This is not free money. Loans have interest. Markets can fall. Collateral requirements can create serious risks. And if the lender requires more collateral during a market decline, you could be forced to sell at exactly the wrong time. So don't hear this rule as, "Borrow money because rich people do." The real lesson is, Don't automatically destroy a productive asset to solve a temporary cash problem. Before selling an asset, consider taxes, future growth, liquidity needs, and alternatives. Sometimes selling is absolutely the right decision. Sometimes protecting the asset makes more sense. The wealthy simply make that decision deliberately. And now we've reached the final rule. Because all the investments, trusts, tax strategies, and compounding in the world won't matter if the family has no system for managing them. That's where rule number 9 comes in. Rule number 9, run the family like an institution. Families that preserve wealth for generations don't rely entirely on good intentions. They create systems. Regular family meetings. Written financial principles. Clear responsibilities. Estate plans. Professional advisors. Rules for making major financial decisions. In other words, they treat the family fortune like something that needs governance. Because eventually, the founder won't be there. Then the children won't be there. Then the grandchildren become the decision makers. And if nobody knows the rules, the entire system can fall apart. The family that lasts doesn't simply say, "We have money." They say, "We are responsible for something that belongs to more than just us." That's the mindset of a steward. And that may be the most important old money rule of all. Because wealth isn't really preserved when one person owns it forever. It's preserved when every generation understands that they're temporarily holding something they are expected to improve, not destroy. So, let's bring all 9 rules together. Rule 1, own things that grow, not things that constantly cost you. Rule 2, stay invisible. Don't spend your future just to look successful today. Rule 3, transfer wealth while you're alive. Teach the next generation before handing them the money. Rule 4, think about taxes before selling your biggest winners. Rule 5, build legal and financial protection around your assets. Rule 6, raise stewards, not spenders. Rule 7, start compounding as early as possible. Rule 8, don't automatically sell productive assets when you need cash. Understand the alternatives and their risks. And finally, Rule 9, run the family wealth like an institution. But here's the most important takeaway. None of these rules require you to be born into a wealthy family. You can start with what you have. Maybe that's $500 in a brokerage account. Maybe it's a 401k you just started contributing to. Maybe it's paying off your credit cards instead of upgrading your car. Maybe it's opening a 529 for your child. Maybe it's simply deciding that your next raise will increase your investments before it increases your lifestyle. That's how generational wealth actually begins. Not with a mansion. Not with a trust worth $50 million. It begins when someone decides, the money I have today needs to create opportunities for the person I become tomorrow. And eventually, that mindset can move beyond one person. You invest. Your children learn. They invest. Your grandchildren inherit knowledge along with assets. And suddenly, what started as a few $1,000s becomes something much larger. That's the real secret behind old money. It's not simply having money. It's having a system that prevents every generation from starting over. Because the goal isn't to die rich. The goal is to build something strong enough that your family has more choices, more security, and more opportunity decades after you're gone. So now I want to hear from you. Which of these 9 old money rules would make the biggest difference in your financial life? Is it living below your means? Investing earlier? Protecting your assets? Or teaching your children about money? Drop your answer in the comments. And remember, don't just build wealth that can survive you.